The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone street outside Buckingham Palace. Sergeant James Mitchell had been a royal guard for 12 years, and he thought he had seen everything. His black boots moved in perfect rhythm as he marched along his designated route, his red uniform pressed to perfection, and his tall bearskin hat sitting firmly on his head. The tourists gathered behind the metal barriers, cameras clicking constantly. Children pointed and waved, hoping to make the stoic guards smile. James kept his face still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. This was his duty, and he took it seriously. Every step was measured, every movement deliberate. As he turned the corner near the palace gates, something caught his attention. Among the sea of excited tourists and their colorful backpacks, there sat an old brown suitcase. It was weathered and worn, with scratches covering its leather surface. The brass locks were tarnished with age, and a faded tag dangled from the handle. James's training kicked in immediately. In today's world, an unattended bag near a royal residence was a serious security concern. He stopped mid-stride, breaking his usual pattern. The crowd noticed immediately. Whispers rippled through the gathering as people wondered why the guard had stopped. James stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the suitcase. It sat about 15 feet away from him, just outside the barrier where tourists stood. Nobody seemed to be near it. Nobody claimed it. His heart began to beat faster, though his face remained calm. He had protocols to follow. Without moving his head, James shifted his eyes, scanning the area for any suspicious activity. The tourists continued to watch him, confused by his sudden stop. Some thought it was part of the ceremony. Others sensed something was wrong and began to look around nervously. The suitcase looked old, perhaps from the 1950s or 60s. It reminded James of the kind his grandmother used to have in her attic. But that didn't make it safe. He knew he needed to act, but he also needed to avoid causing panic among the hundreds of people gathered in the area. James took a deep breath and made a decision. He broke formation completely and began walking toward the suitcase. This was highly unusual. Guards were not supposed to leave their posts without permission. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was happening. As he approached the suitcase, James could see more details. There were old travel stickers on its side, faded and peeling. The leather handle was cracked from years of use. A small padlock hung from one of the brass clasps, but it was open. His hand moved slowly toward his radio, ready to call for backup. But something stopped him. Something about this suitcase felt different. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt sad, almost like it was waiting for someone. James knelt down beside the suitcase, his red uniform standing out against the gray pavement. The crowd pressed closer to the barriers, everyone straining to see what was happening. Other guards had noticed his break in protocol and were moving into position, ready to assist if needed. He examined the suitcase carefully without touching it. The lock was open, which meant someone had accessed it recently, or perhaps it had been left unlocked intentionally. James looked at the faded tag attached to the handle. The ink was smudged and old, but he could make out a name: Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harrison. His breath caught in his throat. That name sounded familiar. James had studied military history extensively during his training, and British military records were something he had always found fascinating. He tried to remember where he had heard that name before. A senior guard approached from behind. "Sergeant Mitchell, what's the situation?" Captain Reynolds asked in a low voice. His eyes scanning the suitcase and the surrounding area, James pointed to the name tag. "Sir, this suitcase belongs to someone named Richard Harrison. I think we should open it, but carefully. Something tells me this isn't a security threat." Captain Reynolds frowned. "That's not our call to make, Sergeant. We should clear the area and call the bomb squad." But James shook his head slightly. "Sir, with respect, look at this suitcase. It's been through decades of life. Those stickers are from the 1940s and 50s. This lock is open. If someone wanted to hurt people, they wouldn't use something this obvious." The captain considered this. He had worked with James for years and trusted his instincts. "All right, but I'm calling this in. We do this by the book." While Captain Reynolds spoke into his radio, James noticed something else. Tucked into the side pocket of the suitcase was a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. He carefully pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a letter, written in neat handwriting that had faded but was still readable. "To whoever finds this," the letter began. James read silently, his eyes moving across the words. "My name is Margaret Harrison. I am leaving this suitcase here because it was my father's dying wish. He was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harrison, and he served in the Coldstream Guards from 1943 to 1960. He loved the palace, loved his service, and loved his country more than anything except his family." James felt a lump forming in his throat. He continued reading. "My father passed away last week at the age of 98. In his final days, he spoke constantly about his time as a guard. He said those were the proudest years of his life. He made me promise to bring his old suitcase, the one he carried when he first arrived in London to begin his service, back to the palace. He wanted it to come home." The letter explained that Margaret was too elderly and ill to make the trip herself, so she had asked a friend to place the suitcase near the palace. She hoped that someone would find it and understand its significance. James looked up at Captain Reynolds, who had finished his radio call. "Sir, you need to read this." Captain Reynolds took the letter from James and read it carefully. His stern expression softened as he absorbed the words. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, with tourists and locals alike, sensing that they were witnessing something special. Security personnel had arrived, but Reynolds held up his hand, signaling them to wait. "Open it," the captain said quietly. "Let's see what's inside." James reached for the clasps of the suitcase. His hands trembled slightly as he unfastened them. The crowd fell completely silent. Even the street performers down the road had stopped their acts. Everyone's attention was focused on the guard kneeling beside the old brown suitcase. The lid creaked as James lifted it open. Inside, carefully arranged, were the belongings of a soldier from another era. On top lay a perfectly folded uniform, the red fabric still vibrant despite the years. The gold buttons gleamed in the sunlight. Beneath it was a bearskin hat, protected in a clear covering. James lifted the uniform carefully and held it up. A gasp went through the crowd. This wasn't just any uniform. This was history. This was someone's pride and legacy. He set it down gently on the clean cloth Captain Reynolds had spread on the ground. Underneath the uniform were photographs. Black and white images showed a young man in his 20s, standing tall and proud in front of Buckingham Palace, the same palace that stood behind them now. In one photo, he was marching with other guards. In another, he was standing at attention, his face serious and dignified. There was also a photograph of the young soldier with a beautiful woman in a white dress. They were smiling, holding hands outside a church. On the back, someone had written, "Richard and Margaret, Wedding Day 1945. James felt his eyes grow moist. This Margaret, the woman who wrote the letter, was the same young bride in this photograph. She had loved this man for over 70 years, and now she was honoring his final wish. More items emerged from the suitcase. There were medals, each one carefully pinned to a velvet display board. James recognized them: the Defense Medal, the War Medal, the Queen's Coronation Medal. This man had served during World War II and continued serving after the war ended. There were letters tied with a faded ribbon. Letters from home, from Margaret, telling Richard about their children, about life in their small village, about how proud she was of him. Some letters were from Richard to Margaret, describing his duties, his hope for the future, his dreams of the family they would build together. Captain Reynolds picked up a small leather journal. He opened it carefully and began to read aloud so James and the nearby security team could hear. "Today was my first day as a Royal Guard. I stood outside these magnificent gates and felt the weight of history on my shoulders. I am protecting not just a building, but everything this nation stands for. My father fought in the First War, and now I serve in the aftermath of the Second. I pray my children will never know war as we have known it." A tourist near the barrier began to cry. Others took out their phones, not to take photos, but to wipe away tears. This was not what anyone expected to see that morning. They had come to watch the changing of the guard, a tourist attraction, a photo opportunity. Instead, they were witnessing something profound. James continued to carefully remove items from the suitcase. Each object told a story of dedication and service. There was a small music box that played the national anthem when opened. A carved wooden figurine of a guard, made by Richard himself, according to a note attached to it. A pocket watch that had stopped at 10:15, perhaps the moment of his death, but at the very bottom of the suitcase, wrapped in soft cloth, was something that made everyone present fall completely silent. It was a flag. The Union Jack folded in the traditional military style. Attached to it was another note in Margaret's handwriting. Captain Reynolds read this note aloud, his voice thick with emotion. This flag flew over the palace on the day Richard completed his final tour of duty in 1960. His commanding officer gave it to him as a retirement gift. Richard kept it in our home for 65 years. He would take it out on special occasions and tell our grandchildren stories about his service. He wanted this flag to return to the palace, to the place where he became the man I loved, the father our children admired, the grandfather our grandchildren adored. By now, several guards had gathered around, their usual stoic expressions replaced with visible emotion. Some of the older guards stood at attention, showing respect for a fellow serviceman they had never met, but whose dedication they understood deeply. James looked up at the growing crowd. Hundreds of people now lined the barriers, all watching in respectful silence. He realized that this moment was bigger than protocol or procedure. This was about honoring a life of service. It's about remembering that behind every uniform stood a real person with dreams, fears, and loved ones. A senior officer arrived. Having been summoned by Captain Reynolds, Major Patricia Thornton had been with the guards for 30 years. She looked at the contents of the suitcase spread carefully on the ground and listened as Reynolds explained the situation. Major Thornton knelt down beside the items. She picked up one of the photographs showing young Richard standing at his post. She studied his face, the determination in his eyes, the pride in his posture. "I know this face," she said quietly. "My father served with Richard Harrison. They were friends. My father spoke of him often, said he was one of the finest guards he ever knew." The coincidence seemed impossible, yet here it was. Major Thornton pulled out her phone and made a call. "I'm calling Richard's daughter, Margaret," she explained. "We should let her know that her father's suitcase was found, that it was opened with respect and care." While they waited for the call to connect, James noticed something else in the suitcase. A small envelope marked for the guard who finds this. His hand shook as he opened it. Inside was a short message from Richard himself. Written in his final weeks, James read it silently first, then looked at Captain Reynolds, who nodded for him to share it with everyone. James stood up, cleared his throat, and began to read in a voice that carried across the silent crowd. "To the guard who finds my suitcase, I want you to know that you are part of something greater than yourself. When I was young like you, I sometimes wondered if standing at my post really mattered. But it does. Every day you wear that uniform, you represent honor, duty, and continuity. You are a living link to centuries of service." James continued reading Richard's letter, his voice growing stronger with each word. "There were days when my feet ached, when the weather was brutal, when I missed my family terribly. But I never regretted my choice to serve. I met my best friends in this service. I learned discipline, respect, and the true meaning of commitment. I became a better man because I wore this uniform." This was not just a story about one soldier. It was about every person who had ever served, who had ever put duty before comfort, who had ever stood watch while others slept safely. "I am 98 years old now," James read on, "and my body is failing, but my memories of my time as a guard remain crystal clear. I can still remember the feel of the cobblestones under my boots, the weight of my rifle, the sound of the crowds. I can remember the pride I felt, knowing I was protecting something precious. If you are reading this, young guard, then you are living my dream one more time. Stand tall, serve well, and know that decades from now, you will look back on these days as some of the best of your life." When James finished reading, there was a moment of profound silence. Then, spontaneously, someone in the crowd began to clap. Others joined in. Soon, hundreds of people were applauding, not for entertainment, but in respect and gratitude. The sound echoed off the palace walls. Major Thornton's phone call had connected. She spoke briefly with Margaret Harrison, explaining what had happened. Then she handed the phone to James. "She wants to speak with you," the major said. James took the phone with trembling hands. "Hello, Mrs. Harrison. This is Sergeant James Mitchell." An elderly voice, weak but clear, came through the phone. "Sergeant, thank you for treating my Richard's belongings with such care. I know this must have been strange for you, finding that suitcase." "Not strange, ma'am," James replied, his voice catching. "It's an honor. Your husband's letter, his service, everything in this suitcase. It reminds me why I do what I do." Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke. "Richard talked about being a guard until his very last day. He said it shaped everything good in his life. He said the discipline he learned helped him be a good husband, a good father. He wanted today's guards to know that what they do matters, that it lasts." James found himself fighting back tears. Around him, guards and tourists alike were deeply moved. This was not a typical day at Buckingham Palace. This was something that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. "Mrs. Harrison," James said, "would you give us permission to display your husband's uniform and items here at the palace? We have a guards museum where visitors can learn about the history of the service. Your husband's story deserves to be told." There was a pause. Then Margaret spoke through her tears. "Richard would have loved that. Yes, please do that. Let people see that behind every uniform is a person who loved, who sacrificed, who served with pride." Major Thornton took the phone back and spoke with Margaret about arrangements. Meanwhile, James carefully began repacking the suitcase with help from Captain Reynolds. Every item was handled with reverence. The uniform was folded perfectly. The photographs were arranged in order. The medals were secured safely. A news crew had arrived, drawn by reports of something unusual happening at the palace. But Major Thornton waved them back, insisting this moment remain respectful and dignified. 3 weeks later, a special ceremony was held at the Guards Museum inside Wellington Barracks, just a short walk from Buckingham Palace. James stood in his dress uniform, nervous but proud. Beside him was an elderly woman in a wheelchair, wrapped in a warm blanket despite the summer weather. Margaret Harrison had made the journey from her home. Determined to see her husband honored one final time, the museum had created a special display case for Richard's belongings. His uniform stood on a mannequin, looking as proud as it must have when he wore it. The photographs lined the wall, showing the progression of his service years. His medals gleamed under the lights. The flag was displayed in a shadow box with a brass K plaque explaining its significance. But the centerpiece was the letter Richard had written. It had been carefully preserved and enlarged so visitors could read his words. Already it had touched thousands of people who had come to see the display. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, staring at the exhibit with tears streaming down her face. James stood beside her, having requested the honor of escorting her to the ceremony. Over the past weeks he had visited her twice, bringing her photos of the display being created and listening to her stories about Richard. "He would be so proud," Margaret whispered. "He always said his time as a guard was when he truly became himself. He learned what he was capable of, what he believed in, who he wanted to be." The museum director gave a speech about the importance of remembering individual stories of service. Major Thornton spoke about her father's friendship with Richard, and how that connection across decades had made this moment possible. Then it was James's turn to speak. He approached the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd of guards, veterans, tourists, and journalists. He had never been good at public speaking, but today the words came easily. "When I stopped at that suitcase 3 weeks ago, I thought I was responding to a potential security threat. Instead, I found something more powerful than any weapon. I found a reminder of why we serve." Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harrison served during one of the most difficult periods in British history. He could have chosen many paths in life, but he chose service. He chose to stand watch, to protect, to be part of something larger than himself. James paused, looking at Margaret. "His daughter told me that Richard believed every small act of duty matters. Every time we stand at our post, every time we maintain discipline, every time we honor the traditions of the guards, we are building something that lasts. We are creating a foundation that future generations will stand upon." He gestured to the display. This uniform, these medals, these letters, they are not just artifacts. They are proof that one life lived with dedication and honor creates ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine. Richard Harrison served from 1943 to 1960. He passed away in 2024. But today, in 2025, his words are inspiring guards who were not even born when he retired. His example is teaching new recruits what it means to serve with pride. The audience applauded, but James raised his hand, not quite finished. Mrs. Harrison asked me to read one final letter that Richard wrote to her just days before he died. She has given me permission to share it with all of you. James unfolded a piece of paper and began to read. My dearest Margaret, I know my time is near. I am not afraid. I have lived a full life, blessed beyond measure. I married the woman I loved. I raised children who made me proud. I served my country with honor. I have no regrets. But I have one final wish. I want young people to know that service matters. Whether they serve in the military, in their communities, or simply by being good and decent people, their choices matter. Every act of kindness, every moment of discipline, every sacrifice made for others creates a better world. Tell them that from me. There was not a dry eye in the room. Margaret was weeping openly, but they were tears of joy mixed with grief. Her Richard was being remembered not as a name in a record book, but as a real person whose life had meant something.